Hey Calvary families, I hope that you've had a great Christmas and a great time celebrating Jesus' birth. And if you remember through the whole month of December, we've been learning about the Christmas story. We've learned about the hope that Jesus provided to people in the Old Testament by promising a Messiah who would come and save his people from their sins. We learned about that God is faithful and that he provided that Messiah just like he said he would. And then we learned about the joy the shepherds had upon hearing about the good news of Jesus' birth. And we learned about that God brought peace between all people, both Jews and Gentiles, and God through the work of his son Jesus. Well, this week we're going to learn about the ascension, or when Jesus went back into heaven after he rose from the dead. And we're going to look at what that has to do with us today and what that has to do with Christmas. So pause and as a family, turn to Matthew 28:18. Jesus spent time with his disciples for 40 days after he was raised from the dead, and he eventually told his disciples to meet him on a mountaintop. Pause and as a family, summarize what Jesus told the disciples in Matthew 28:18 through 20. Specifically, what did he command them to do? Jesus commanded the disciples to go and tell everyone about Jesus, people of all nations all over the world. And not only were they to tell people about Jesus, but then they were to baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Trinity, which is how we still baptize people today. And then he also commanded them to tell and instruct everyone what God has commanded. And so pause and as a family, turn to Acts 1:4. So when you look at Acts 1:4, Jesus tells the disciples not to leave Jerusalem, but to wait until he sends someone, and that someone is the Holy Spirit. The disciples then ask Jesus, "Jesus, are you coming to set up your kingdom here on earth right now?" You see, the disciples thought that Jesus was coming and was going to chase away the Romans, the group of people who were currently in charge of God's people, ruling over God's people. And the Jews didn't really like the Romans very much. However, God has an entirely different plan in mind. So pause it as a family. Talk about what God told the disciples to do in Acts 1:8. Jesus told the disciples to be witnesses of him, to tell other people about him, and to do this all over the world, both locally and nationally and internationally. So local people like Judea, Samaria, and then also all the way to the ends of the earth. And after Jesus says this, he goes into heaven. He returns to heaven to be with God the Father. And the disciples watch him go up into the clouds. And they just stand there and kind of stare up at the clouds for a while, and then two angels appear and tell them something. So pause and as a family, see if you can figure out what the angels tell the disciples. The angels told the disciples that someday Jesus would return in the same way he left. In other words, in the same way that Jesus went into heaven, ascended into heaven, someday when Jesus comes back, he's going to return from heaven. So then the question is what does this story have to do with us? What does this story of Jesus going back into heaven have to do with us now and have to do with the Christmas story, which we just celebrated? Well, pause and as a family, read Luke 21:27 through 28. In the passage you just read, Jesus promised that someday he would return in power and glory, which is different than the first time he came, because as we celebrate at Christmas, the first time Jesus came, he came humbly and came kind of quietly into the world as this little baby born to Joseph and Mary. But when Jesus comes back, when he returns, he's going to come in full power, full glory, coming as a king and conqueror, ready to permanently defeat sin, death, and Satan. And what this has to do with Christmas is that if you remember between the Old Testament and the New Testament, even though in our Bibles it's only a couple of pages, that actually stands for 400 years of waiting for the Messiah to come the first time, waiting for Jesus to come the first time. And in kind of a similar way, we also live in a time of waiting. You see, we're not waiting for Jesus to come the first time, but we're waiting for Jesus to return. And as we mentioned, God gave us an important job to do. He told us that we should tell other people about him and the freedom he has to offer. And even though Jesus hasn't returned to establish his earthly kingdom yet, we can be a part of God's kingdom now by spreading the good news about Jesus. So until next time, Calvary kids, see ya.